There's something beautifully absurd about discovering the meaning of life while plummeting toward your death at 120 miles per hour. The ground rushes up to meet you like an overeager handshake. And in that moment of pure, undiluted terror, your brain finally stops lying to you about what really matters. No pretenses, no social media filters, just pure, unadulterated truth hurtling toward concrete reality. Now, before you start thinking this is another one of those feel-good motivational stories where everything works out in the end, let me stop you right there. Sometimes life hands you a parachute that's about as reliable as a chocolate teapot. And sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of humor that would make even the darkest comedian uncomfortable. Meet Marcus Wellington. And yes, that's his real name, because apparently his parents thought adding Wellington would give him gravitas, like he was destined to conquer something significant. Instead, Marcus conquered middle management at a paper supply company, drove a beige Honda Civic, and had a houseplant named Gerald that he talked to more than most humans. But here's the thing about seemingly ordinary people. They're the ones who often stumble into the most extraordinary situations, usually by accident, and almost always at the worst possible moment. Marcus was about to become living proof that the universe doesn't check your resume before handing out life-altering experiences. You see, Marcus had been having the same recurring dream for 3 months. Not the typical falling dream that psychologists love to analyze. Oh no, this was far more specific and infinitely more disturbing. In his dream, he was skydiving, his parachute failed, and during those final moments of free fall, he experienced what he could only describe as cosmic clarity, a complete understanding of his place in the universe, the meaning of existence, and why hot dogs come in packages of 10, but buns come in packages of 8. The dream was so vivid, so consistently detailed, that Marcus began to wonder if it was less of a dream and more of a premonition. Or maybe it was his subconscious trying to tell him something profound about his mundane existence. Either way, it bothered him enough that he did something completely out of character. He booked a skydiving lesson. Now, you might think this was brave or stupid, or perhaps a bit of both. But what you probably don't realize is that this decision would lead Marcus to confront questions that most of us spend our entire lives avoiding. What does it mean to truly live? Is there a difference between existing and being alive? And most importantly, if you only had 60 seconds left on Earth, would you spend them calculating your velocity or finally admitting that you've been sleepwalking through life? Stick around, because Marcus is about to find out answers to questions he never knew he was asking. And trust me, his journey is going to make you question everything you think you know about courage, consciousness, and the cosmic joke we call human existence. Marcus Wellington had always been the kind of guy who read the terms and conditions before clicking I agree, folded his underwear in perfect squares, and maintained a detailed spreadsheet of his monthly expenses down to the penny. So naturally, when he walked into Adrenaline Adventures Skydiving Center, a name that should have been his first red flag, he brought a 3-ring binder full of research, safety statistics, and a hand-drawn diagram of parachute mechanisms. The instructor, a sun-weather man named Tank who looked like he'd been personally wrestling gravity for decades, took one look at Marcus's binder and chuckled. First time, actually, Marcus replied, adjusting his glasses. I've been preparing for 3 weeks. Did you know that the fatality rate for tandem skydiving is approximately 0.0007%? That's statistically safer than driving to work. Tank raised an eyebrow. You calculated the odds? I calculated everything. Terminal velocity, air resistance coefficients, the tensile strength of modern parachute materials. Marcus flipped through his binder with the enthusiasm of someone presenting quarterly earnings. I even researched the psychological effects of extreme altitude on decision-making capabilities. What Marcus hadn't researched, however, was why a seemingly rational person would voluntarily jump out of a perfectly functional airplane because of a recurring dream. That particular piece of data wasn't available in any spreadsheet. The truth was, Marcus had been living what philosophers might call an unexamined life, going through the motions without ever questioning the motions themselves. He woke up at 6:47 a.m., ate the same breakfast, 2 pieces of wheat toast, butter on one side only, drove the same route to work, 14 minutes and 37 seconds in light traffic, and had the same conversations with the same people about the same mundane topics. His co-worker Janet had once asked him, "Marcus, don't you ever want to do something spontaneous?" To which he'd replied, "Spontaneity is just poor planning disguised as adventure." But the dreams had changed something. Each night, as he plummeted toward the earth in his sleep, he felt more alive than he ever did during his waking hours. It was as if his subconscious was sending him increasingly urgent memos. "Dear Marcus, you are not living. You are simply organizing your way toward death. Please respond accordingly." So here he was, standing in a hangar that smelled like jet fuel and regret, about to do the most uncharacteristic thing of his 34-year existence. Tank began the safety briefing, but Marcus barely listened. He was too busy having what could only be described as a philosophical crisis at 30,000 feet before he'd even left the ground. Was courage the absence of fear, or was it feeling the fear and jumping anyway? And why did humans seem hardwired to seek experiences that triggered their most primal survival instincts? The thing about skydiving, Tank was saying, is that it strips away all the bullshit. Up there, you can't pretend to be someone you're not. Gravity doesn't care about your job title or your credit score. It's just you and the physics of falling. Marcus nodded, scribbling notes in his binder margins. But something about Tank's words resonated deeper than the technical specifications. Maybe that's what his dreams were trying to tell him. That he'd been so busy managing risk that he'd forgotten how to actually live with it. As they suited up, Marcus caught his reflection in a mirror. The man staring back looked like someone cosplaying as an adventurer. All the gear, none of the confidence. His parachute harness was adjusted to manufacturer specifications, his helmet properly secured, his altimeter calibrated. Everything was perfect except for the growing realization that no amount of preparation could prepare him for what came next. "You ready?" Tank asked, checking Marcus's equipment one final time. Marcus looked at his binder, then at the airplane waiting outside, then back at Tank. For the first time in years, he didn't have a plan for what happened next. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was possibly the most honest moment he'd experienced since childhood. "Actually," Marcus said, closing his binder with uncharacteristic decisiveness, "I don't think anyone's ever really ready for something like this. But that's probably the point, isn't it?" Tank grinned. "Now you're getting it." As they walked toward the plane, Marcus wondered if this was how all great adventures began. Not with heroic declarations or dramatic music, but with the simple admission that sometimes the most rational thing you can do is something completely irrational. Little did Marcus know, the universe was about to test that theory in ways his spreadsheets had never accounted for. The Cessna 182 looked like it had been held together with duct tape, prayers, and what Marcus sincerely hoped was professional-grade optimism. As he climbed aboard, he couldn't help but notice that the interior had all the luxurious appointments of a storage shed, which, given the circumstances, seemed oddly appropriate. "This plane is older than I am," Marcus observed, running his hand along what appeared to be original 1970s upholstery. "Age brings wisdom," Tank replied, settling in beside him. "This old bird has made this trip thousands of times. She knows what she's doing, even when we don't." As the engine sputtered to life, Marcus experienced something that his risk assessment spreadsheets had failed to quantify: the profound absurdity of modern human existence. Here he was, a creature that had evolved to live safely on solid ground, willingly climbing into a metal contraption designed to carry him so high that the air itself became too thin to breathe. Also, he could throw himself back toward the earth while trusting his life to a piece of fabric that folded up into a backpack. When viewed from an evolutionary perspective, skydiving made about as much sense as fish deciding to take up mountain climbing. "You ever think about how weird this is?" Marcus shouted over the engine noise as they climbed toward 13,000 feet. "I mean, from a biological standpoint, everything about this violates our most basic programming." Tank laughed. "That's the beauty of it. We're the only species dumb enough, or smart enough, to deliberately scare ourselves for fun. A gazelle doesn't bungee jump. A dolphin doesn't go wingsuit flying. Only humans look at perfectly good survival instincts and think, you know what? Let's ignore those completely." As the altimeter crept higher, Marcus found himself contemplating the strange relationship between fear and consciousness. Were humans the only animals that could conceptualize their own mortality clearly enough to be simultaneously terrified and fascinated by it. Did other species experience existential dread? Or was that particular form of psychological torture uniquely human? Through the small window, the world below had transformed into something resembling a topographical map. Roads became thin lines, cars turned into moving dots, and entire neighborhoods shrank to the size of postage stamps. From this height, the daily concerns that consumed most of Marcus's mental energy, traffic jams, quarterly reports, whether Gerald the houseplant needed more plant food, seemed laughably insignificant. It's funny, Marcus mused, more to himself than to Tank, how getting further away from something makes you see it more clearly. Altitude gives perspective, Tank agreed. Most people spend their whole lives looking at trees and never see the forest. Up here, you see the whole damn ecosystem. At 10,000 feet, Marcus began to understand something that no amount of research could have prepared him for. The relationship between physical and metaphysical elevation. The higher they climbed, the smaller his problems appeared. But paradoxically, the bigger his questions became. What was he doing with his life? When had he stopped dreaming about possibilities and started only planning for probabilities? His recurring dream suddenly made perfect sense. His subconscious wasn't trying to kill him. It was trying to wake him up. The falling wasn't about death. It was about finally feeling fully alive. The parachute failure wasn't a nightmare. It was a metaphor for all the safety nets he'd built around himself that had ultimately become cages. At 12,000 feet, Tank began the final equipment check. Remember, he said, testing Marcus's harness connections, when we jump, you're going to experience about 60 seconds of free fall. That's 60 seconds where nothing matters except right now. No past, no future, just pure present moment awareness. Marcus nodded, but inside his mind was racing with the implications. 60 seconds of enforced mindfulness. 60 seconds where his brain couldn't wander to grocery lists or work deadlines or social anxieties. 60 seconds of what Buddhists spent years meditating to achieve. Complete presence in the current moment. What if, Marcus said suddenly, what if consciousness itself is just a very elaborate form of falling? Like, we're all constantly plummeting through time, and what we call thinking is just our attempt to create the illusion of control during the descent. Tank paused mid-equipment check. Dude, that's either really deep or complete nonsense, but either way, save it for after we land. Right now, let's focus on not becoming a human pancake. At 13,000 feet, the pilot gave them the signal. It was time. As they moved toward the open door, Marcus felt his carefully constructed worldview beginning to disintegrate. Not in a terrifying way, but like watching a cocoon dissolve to make room for whatever came next. He'd spent 34 years building elaborate systems to avoid uncertainty. But uncertainty, he was beginning to realize, might be the only thing that made life worth living. The wind rushing through the open door sounded like the universe laughing at its own joke. And for the first time in his adult life, Marcus found himself laughing along. Ready to find out who you really are? Tank shouted over the wind. Marcus looked down at the earth spread out below like an impossibly detailed painting, took a deep breath, and made a decision that would have horrified his previous self. He stopped thinking and started trusting. Let's go, he said. But as Marcus was about to discover, the universe had been saving its biggest punchline for last. The moment Marcus Wellington left the airplane, several things happened simultaneously that would have made Isaac Newton weep with either laughter or mathematical despair. First, his body achieved what physicists call terminal velocity, approximately 120 miles per hour, which sounds technical and precise until you realize it's basically the speed at which a human being becomes a very inefficient projectile. Second, his brain, finally freed from the luxury of overthinking, experienced what can only be described as cosmic giggling. Every philosophical question that had ever kept him awake at night suddenly seemed hilarious. Why? Because when you're falling through the sky at the speed of a very motivated cheetah, abstract concepts like meaning and purpose transform into something much simpler. Don't become a crater. Third, and most importantly for our story, Marcus discovered that his parachute had what technical experts would call a fundamental design flaw, and what everyone else would call holy shit, this is not supposed to happen. Tank pulled the ripcord at exactly 5,500 feet, just as they practiced. The pilot chute deployed perfectly, pulling the main parachute from its container with textbook precision. For approximately 2.3 seconds, everything went according to plan. Then physics decided to get creative. Instead of the reassuring jerk of deceleration that should have followed, Marcus felt something that can only be described as continued acceleration with a side of existential panic. The main parachute, rather than inflating into the life-saving canopy it was designed to be, had become what aerospace engineers technically term a very expensive streamer, essentially a $3,000 ribbon fluttering uselessly above them. Well, Tank said with the kind of calm that only comes from years of professional experience or complete psychological dissociation, this is new. Marcus, meanwhile, was experiencing what philosophers call radical present moment awareness and what everyone else calls pants-wetting terror. Time seemed to slow down, not in the peaceful, meditative way described in spiritual texts, but in the way that allows you to count every heartbeat while calculating exactly how many of them you have left. But here's where things got interesting. And by interesting, I mean cosmically absurd in a way that would make Kafka proud. Instead of panicking, Marcus began to laugh. Not the nervous laughter of someone in denial, but deep, genuine belly laughs that seemed completely inappropriate for someone plummeting toward Earth at highway speeds. Tank looked at him with the expression of someone questioning whether his tandem partner had suffered altitude-induced psychosis. "You find this funny?" Tank shouted, reaching for the reserve parachute handle. "Don't you see?" Marcus replied, tears streaming from his eyes, though whether from laughter or wind resistance was unclear. "This is the most honest I've ever been. For 34 years, I've been pretending I had control over anything, and now I'm literally falling through the sky with broken safety equipment, and somehow this feels more real than anything I've ever experienced." Tank deployed the reserve chute. It opened perfectly, jerking them into a gentle descent. But Marcus was still lost in his revelatory hysteria. "I spent 3 weeks researching parachute failure rates," he continued, "and calculated the odds at 0.0007%. But I never researched what it would feel like to be in that 0.0007%. It's like winning the worst lottery in the universe, except instead of money, you win clarity." As they drifted down under the reserve canopy, Marcus experienced what psychologists call post-traumatic growth, and what he would later describe to his therapist as the moment I stopped being afraid of being afraid. The ground approached at a manageable pace now, giving Marcus time to process what had just happened. He'd faced his literal worst nightmare, the exact scenario from his recurring dream, and instead of dying, he discovered something profound about the nature of living. "You know what's funny?" he told Tank as they prepared for landing. "I always thought courage was about not being scared. But it's not, is it? Courage is about being absolutely terrified and doing it anyway. It's about accepting that everything is uncertain, everything is fragile, and that's what makes it precious." They landed in a field that looked exactly like every field Marcus had ever seen, except that he was seeing it with completely different eyes. The grass was the same green it had always been, but somehow more green. The sky was the same blue, but with depth he'd never noticed. Even the air tasted different, not because it had changed, but because he had. Tank helped him out of the harness, shaking his head with a mixture of relief and bewilderment. "In 20 years of doing this, I've never had someone have a spiritual awakening during equipment failure. Usually people just scream." "I did scream," Marcus replied, "but it was on the inside. And what I was screaming was finally." As they walked back toward the hangar, Marcus realized that his recurring dream had been trying to tell him something far more complex than he'd understood. It wasn't about death, it was about rebirth. The parachute failure wasn't a nightmare. It was a metaphor for all the safety nets that needed to fail so he could learn to fly on his own terms. He thought about Gerald the houseplant, waiting faithfully at home, and smiled. Tomorrow he was going to have a very different conversation with that philodendron. He was going to tell Gerald about the day he learned that the opposite of safety isn't danger, it's aliveness. But most importantly, Marcus realized he was going to stop calculating the odds of living and start living regardless of the odds. However, as Marcus would soon discover, the real adventure was just beginning. 3 months later, Marcus Wellington sat in his office cubicle, staring at a spreadsheet that might as well have been written in ancient Sanskrit for all the meaning it held for him. The quarterly supply chain optimization report that had once consumed weeks of his attention now seemed like elaborate performance art, a ritualistic dance around the void of corporate purposelessness. His coworker Janet approached his desk, coffee in hand, wearing the expression of someone about to deliver either gossip or bad news. "Marcus, you've been different lately. Ever since that skydiving thing you did. Are you having some kind of midlife crisis?" Marcus looked up from his computer screen, where columns of data swam like abstract art. "Janet, do you ever wonder if fish know they're wet?" She blinked. "What?" "I've been thinking about consciousness," he continued, leaning back in his chair with the casual confidence of someone who'd recently stared death in the face and found it surprisingly reasonable. "Like, we spend our whole lives swimming in this ocean of assumptions, that security means safety, that routine equals stability, that avoiding risk is the same as preserving life. But what if we're just fish who've never questioned the water?" Janet set down her coffee with the careful precision of someone dealing with a potential office-crazy person. "Marcus, are you feeling okay?" Because HR has pamphlets about work-life balance and stress management. The truth was, Marcus had never felt more okay in his entire life, which was precisely the problem. When you've spent decades operating under the assumption that okay means safely miserable, discovering what actually okay feels like creates a certain amount of existential whiplash. Since his parachute malfunction, which he'd taken to calling his gravitational awakening, Marcus had been conducting what he thought of as life experiments. Instead of taking the same route to work, he chose random streets, discovering entire neighborhoods he'd never known existed despite driving past them for years. Instead of eating the same wheat toast breakfast, he'd been trying foods he couldn't pronounce from cultures he'd never explored. Most importantly, he'd been having actual conversations with Gerald the houseplant. And while Gerald remained professionally silent, Marcus had discovered that talking to something that couldn't interrupt or judge was incredibly therapeutic. "The thing is, Janet," Marcus said, opening his desk drawer and pulling out a small notebook he'd started keeping, "I used to think life was about minimizing variables and maximizing predictability. But that's not living. That's just very elaborate death postponement." He flipped through pages covered with observations that would have seemed completely uncharacteristic 3 months earlier. "Noticed 7 different types of clouds today. When did I stop looking up? Helped elderly neighbor with groceries. When did helping others become inefficient? Gerald seems to lean toward the window more on Tuesdays. Coincidence or phototropic routine?" Janet peered at the notebook with the fascination of someone discovering that their boring coworker had been secretly documenting alien behavior. "You're keeping a journal?" "I'm documenting consciousness," Marcus corrected. "Turns out, paying attention to life is a skill, and like most skills, it atrophies if you don't practice it." The phone on Marcus's desk rang. He looked at the caller ID, his supervisor, and for the first time in his professional career, he let it go to voicemail. Janet's eyes widened as if she'd just witnessed someone casually defy gravity. "Marcus, that was Mr. Henderson. You can't just ignore Mr. Henderson." "Sure I can," Marcus replied, closing his notebook and standing up. "Watch this." He walked over to the office window, the same window he'd walked past thousands of times without really seeing, and looked out at the city spread below. From the 15th floor, people looked like they had from the airplane. Tiny, busy, seemingly purposeful from a distance, but ultimately impossible to understand without getting closer. "You know what I realized up there?" Marcus said, still looking out the window. "Fear isn't the opposite of courage. Boredom is." He turned back to Janet, who was now looking at him with a mixture of concern and fascination typically reserved for people who've either found enlightenment or completely lost their minds. "I spent 34 years being afraid of uncertainty, so I chose certainty. But certainty without uncertainty is just elaborate sleepwalking. I was so busy avoiding the risk of living that I forgot to actually live." His phone buzzed with a text message from Tank. "How's the ground treating you, philosopher?" Marcus smiled and typed back, still figuring out how to land, as he gathered his things to leave. Not for lunch, not for a meeting, but simply because he wanted to go outside and remember what fresh air tasted like. Janet called after him. "Where are you going?" Marcus paused at the office door, thinking about Gerald waiting at home, about the recurring dream that had stopped recurring, about the strange lightness that comes from finally accepting that everything is temporary, including temporary itself. "I'm gonna go practice being alive," he said. "Wanna come?" For a moment, Janet looked like she might actually say yes. Then her phone rang. Her computer chimed with an email, and the familiar gravity of routine pulled her back in her chair. Marcus understood. He'd been in that chair for years, but now he knew something Janet didn't. The chair would always be there. The question was whether you'd still be you when you finally decided to stand up. And sometimes, the most radical thing you can do is simply refuse to land where everyone expects you to. Marcus Wellington never did finish that quarterly supply chain optimization report. 6 months after his gravitational awakening, he was living in a small apartment with 3 houseplants. Gerald had made friends, working part-time at the skydiving center, and writing a book he'd never planned to write about the philosophy of falling. The book, tentatively titled Terminal Velocity, A Guide to Conscious Living, was essentially a love letter to uncertainty, disguised as a memoir about a parachute malfunction. In it, Marcus argued that humans are the only species capable of deliberately scaring themselves into enlightenment, and that maybe, just maybe, that's not a bug in our psychological programming. It's a feature. He still calculated odds sometimes, but now he calculated the odds of miraculous coincidences, unexpected joys, and beautiful disasters. He discovered that life becomes exponentially more interesting when you stop trying to control it and start trying to dance with it instead. The recurring dream never returned, but Marcus didn't miss it. He learned that the best dreams aren't the ones you have while sleeping. They're the ones you're brave enough to live while awake. And Gerald the houseplant, Gerald thrived in his new environment, growing toward windows Marcus had never bothered to open, reaching for light that had always been there, waiting for someone to finally let it in. Sometimes the most profound journeys begin with the simple recognition that you've been standing still. Sometimes wisdom comes disguised as equipment failure, and sometimes the only way to truly learn how to live is to practice falling again and again until you realize that the ground was never the destination anyway. The sky, as it turns out, was always the point. What dreams have you been postponing? What parachutes in your life need to fail so you can learn to fly? Share your thoughts below, and if this story made you question anything about your own relationship with uncertainty, you know what to do.